This episode of Q Point Podcast is pre-recorded, produced and sponsored by Karina Quirk, broker at Next Home Experience.
Different views.
I know your story.
From different cues.
Incredible job.
He's David Quirk.
You brought it up.
And she's Karina Quirk.
Imagine.
This is
Q Point.
Now joining us in studio is Republican gubernatorial candidate Ben Midgley. Welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for coming in, Ben. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
How did your recent announcement for governor go? How was that event?
Yes, we had a great launch event. We were down in Kennebunkport at, we call it the Barn. It's a local guy's barn who's big in the lobster industry. I won't mention his name. I don't know if I'd have his permission to do that, but we had about 60 people there and we had some great TV coverage. My wife opened things up, which took a little convincing. She'd never spoken in front of television cameras before. And then Senator Matt Harrington got up, gave a great introduction. And then I had about 7.5 minutes to talk to everybody. And everyone in the room had some really good energy and got out of there without a hitch. So, happy with where we're at. And now, the real work begins.
I read a little bit about your speech, and you've spoken about growing up in poverty, and then you built an international fitness business, which is the American dream. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, I think I just want to correct a little bit of that. I didn't view myself as growing up in poverty. I felt like my childhood was pretty normal, right? I didn't know certain financial challenges my parents were going through. My mom worked really, really hard to hide some of that, and she'd probably kill me for saying it, but it wasn't more than a year and a half ago. She told me there was times she was stealing toilet paper from the town hall, but you wouldn't notice that as a kid. I think we lived in a pretty decent middle-class home, and then the homes just sort of started going down smaller. But just to be honest, that didn't affect me. As long as I had my friends and we were outside and we were having fun, that was great. When things got tougher for me is I didn't do great in high school. So I took a gap year from high school and went and worked at a ski resort and just had some fun. And then when I figured out I had to do something, came back and decided to go to college and took a shot at going to college out in California because honestly, my friends said there was girls out there. And at that age, that seemed interesting. None of that worked out. But when I headed out to school, my parents gave me $500. And then I went out to college and tried to make it work and couldn't put it together. It was a little bit hard having $500 to start working 3 jobs. But one of the jobs I worked out there was cleaning machines in a gym in exchange for a membership. And that just got me interested in the gym industry. And I tried to learn pretty much anything I could about that. And then left that environment because I wasn't doing well. Came home, tried to support my mom because my parents were going through a divorce at that time. And there was a period when I came back that I ended up on unemployment and food stamps. And that was when things were not going so well. But this was back in the day when food stamps were brightly colored tickets. And I don't know if people even remember those now. You'd tear them off in the grocery store aisle and they were kind of like Monopoly money. And it's very sobering from that standpoint, at least for me. And I just realized I didn't want to be in that position anymore. So just dug in and tried to figure out what can I do? And I kind of created a love for the fitness industry and just, taking care of yourself. And people are always so nice to you in the gym. You're down there cleaning the treadmill, while they're working out and they're talking to you. You're cleaning the bathrooms or whatever it is. And it was just a really great environment. And I had gotten into fitness because when I was working at that ski resort, I still remember the day. I looked in the mirror at one point, and I'm about 210 pounds now. I'm 6'3". I was about 160 pounds back then. I used to smoke cigarettes and have some fun with the guys. And I remember looking in the mirror, and I used to have a big mullet back then, which I don't have. I know it's radio. You can't see me, but my hair is pretty short. And I said, you got to change something. I was like, this is not going to work. So I won't bring you that through that whole story, but ended up getting into fitness back then. So really liked the community in the gym. And then after kind of going through that period of food stamps and digging back in 30 years later, I've ended up being the president of Planet Fitness, which is, one of the largest fitness franchises in the world, and then left there and started another company called Crunch Fitness Franchising. And then over 15 years, built that into the number one fitness franchise in the country at over 500 locations, 3 million members, $1 billion in revenue. But most importantly, we created 15,000 jobs with that company. And it's still growing. I've left there, and I think it's the best fitness company in the industry now. But now I'm just watching them grow from the outside and taking on a new challenge.
And a new one will be opening in Maine?
Yep, they've already announced the lease they signed. It's going to be in South Portland, and then they're probably going to sign 2 or 3 more leases. That's a franchise group. Great group, runs all through New England. So excited to see the first one finally get to Maine now that I'm not with the company anymore.
So let me ask you this. What made you decide to run for governor?
For the longest time, obviously, growing up in the state, life was great as you're a kid here. There's almost no cares in the world when you're a young kid growing up in Maine. You can go out in the woods with your buddies and everything's fun at school, sports games and whatever to keep you busy. You didn't have the internet back then, right? It was a different situation. The beach was pretty close where I grew up. So you could go in the woods, you go to the beach, you can go out and do fishing, whatever it is you want. It was just fantastic. And over the years, it always felt like Maine was a little bit sort of behind the rest of the country in terms of things that are affecting other states and other cities. We just didn't experience that here. So you felt like you were kind of in your own little bubble, but in a good way. Kids could grow up and come in from playing whenever they got back. It didn't really matter. Your parents wanted you in before whatever your curfew was. And then over time, you start to see things happening in other places. And then, years later, they start happening here. And you're like, well, what's going on with that? Why is that happening? And then as you go through your stages of life and you get married, you have kids, you go through a career, you really start to realize why those things are happening. And a lot of those things are based on decisions that are being made by the state government. Sometimes it's federal, but in our case, a lot of it's been state over the years. Then you realize some people are having a harder time than they were before. And maybe some business closed that you really liked. And what's the cause of that? And you know where I'm going with this. So it's kind of this gradual erosion of what I felt was the best way of life, truly the way life should be, which is on our sign. And it's sort of gotten to the point that it's not the way life should be. And it's not that it's bad. It's just it shouldn't be like this. And it doesn't have to be like this for so many Mainers anymore. And when you've been through the process that I have, and I have experienced the American dream, I've been very successful and very grateful for that. But I also know what it's like to have nothing. So when you understand how hard you have to work just to get from here to here, and you know how hard Mainers work, because we have some of the hardest working people on earth, literally, not the biggest economy, you have an appreciation for what you get. And when you see that being made harder on people gradually and consistently, then you sort of have to stand up and say, look, you can either sit by and watch as things get worse, or you can stick your neck out there and, go try to make a difference. So that's why I'm doing this and what I'm really committed to. Also, my father, he spent his life in public service in the military. I always felt like I missed an opportunity not serving in the military. My dad, gave his life to veterans after he passed away, which was May of last year. He was American Legionnaire of the Year for the whole state of Maine, which is probably the biggest honor of his life. And I'm very close with the folks at the American Legion in Sanford and Springville. They're incredible people, do incredible stuff. So, public service has always been there. And, now that I'm retired and have some resources that I'm also going to commit to this, now's the time to see if we can make a difference for the people of the state.
You are listening to Q Point Podcast. I'm Karina Quirk, co-hosting with my husband, David Quirk. And we're having a conversation with Maine Republican gubernatorial candidate, Ben Midgley. Property taxes have skyrocketed. How will you address that?
I think when you look at taxes, you have to look at all the taxes, right? Because the state has no money, any way you cut it. And that's one of the problems here. The state's lost respect for people's money. Without taxes, you can't run a state. So right now, Maine's one of the highest tax states in the country. And we have one of the lowest incomes in the country, which is very burdensome to individuals and businesses. You could make some easy comparisons to what New Hampshire is doing versus what we're doing. And they're a much lower tax state. They have a much friendlier business environment. They rank higher in almost all levels. They have no minimum wage. And they have the lowest poverty rate, I think, in the country. I was talking to Governor Sununu the other day, who's a fantastic guy and just did a tremendous job there. And it's almost hard to understand how a state that has an average age that's only a half year lower than us is doing so much better. And it's because they care more about the people's money. So the tax burden in Maine is spread out. You have a high property tax now, which you used to think New Hampshire had the highest property tax. You have high income tax, which is going to go higher. You've got a bill in the legislature now for changing the levels of income tax, as well as adding a capital gains tax, which wasn't there before. And they have nowhere else to go at this point. So when you have sort of an exodus of taxpayers in the state, I think we've gone from roughly 2,500 millionaires down to somewhere between 500 and 750 over the years. Those numbers may not be 100% right, but that's a lot of tax dollars leaving. Businesses are not succeeding as well as they used to. So you have a lowering of the tax base there. You have a third of the state that's on some sort of state welfare, whether it's Maine Care or something else. And when you start to reduce the overall tax base, and then you have more and more folks requiring social services because they fall off a cliff. If you go too high in your income level, you lose your benefits, which is a whole separate subject we could talk about. You have no choice but to continue raising revenue somehow. Now, if the Democrats would just stop the spending, the revenue levels we're at now would suffice to keep you at least at a bare break-even level, but that certainly hasn't been the case. So in order to get the taxes down, you definitely have to stir the economy up. You've got to create some better incentives for businesses. Businesses are getting hit from all angles. Energy is one of the biggest things, extra fees and such like FMLA and other hoops that businesses have to jump through. You've got to reduce those stresses on the businesses. And then you've got to get into the budget itself. I mean, the budget has gone from $7 billion to what's going to end up being close to 12. If you hadn't read the budget, the summary budget's about 57 line items long, and you've got 78% of the budget's tied up in DHHS and the Department of Education. That's really the big drivers for costs. So if someone's going to do it right, and you hear a lot of Republicans talking about getting into office and cutting the budget, you have to do that properly, especially if you're a Republican. And to do that, you've got to get in and you've got to have the know-how to look through every one of those budget items, not 57 lines, but there's going to be hundreds, if not thousands of line items. You have to go through and see where is all that money going to before you go and make that cut. Is it being spent efficiently and effectively? And then you make the changes based on all the best information, so you don't really negatively impact people's lives, right? Because you don't want to get into office, go in and stir the pot that you're cutting costs so badly that you end up really creating some anger in the state. So you got to do that methodically and purposely, and then you make the cuts exactly where you need to cut. So the spending starts to go down. You have less of a requirement for revenue. You start to get revenues going up on the other end. You put more money in folks' pockets by changing some of the energy policy, which is a longer conversation we can talk about separately. And then the governor has to be the number one salesperson for the state. They have to be out in front of it all the time, bringing business investment into the state. Because without the jobs and businesses succeeding at all levels, you're never going to be able to get out of this, right? But it's kind of a multi-pieced formula to put all those things together. So, reducing the state budget effectively and appropriately, spurring business growth, lowering energy costs, and then all of a sudden the wheels start to turn in the right direction. You get your hands around it, triage the patient there, and then you can go in and get things moving more effectively. But first, we've got to kind of stop the bleeding, assess where we're at, and then build up from there.
So as you know, we are the oldest state in the country. And I'm not sure if it's older people moving into the state or younger people leaving the state, which makes us the older state. And obviously, the older the people are in the state, the more that they put on the hospitals. Obviously, older people go to the hospital more than younger people, right? And we are having a problem with our hospitals closing in some of these smaller areas. What is your suggestion of how we keep these hospitals profitable and that they can stay in business?
I think the biggest problem for the hospitals are the amount of folks that are on main care and the reimbursement levels, which you've probably heard before. They're reimbursed at about 60 cents on the dollar. And when you have an aging population or the younger population moving out, you just end up with more folks that have higher health needs in the hospitals, which are more expensive. You have less of a healthy population that they're servicing, so that you can't kind of cost average out the cost of healthcare for the greater population, which is how healthcare is priced, essentially, the average use throughout the whole population. And, the hospitals can't carry the burden anymore. If you're constantly treating folks, especially a lot of folks who use the emergency room as their primary care, in the way they come in and get taken care of, there's no way for them to stay financially viable. So originally, when you had the expansion, hospitals in the state wanted it, because they thought the extra volume would be helpful. But then as too many folks go on it and the reimbursement levels average between the expansion rates and the original rates around 64%, give or take, it's just not enough to keep them viable. So the first thing you have to do is create a bridge for people to get off of main care. The way it works now is if you make just enough money, you fall off a cliff and you lose your benefits. So you really have to, and you'd have to work with the federal government, you have to have a federal waiver for this. You have to create a bridge so folks can continue to make more money and not lose their health insurance. Maybe they contribute $50 a month when they hit a certain level, or $100 a month when they make a certain level. All of that is going to contribute substantially to the state's budget, takes cost off of that, gives the hospitals a little bit more money, and then you start to get those wheels turning again. I think first you've got to address the real reimbursement rates for the hospitals, and then you got to create that bridge for folks to find more opportunity. And then the other thing, if you look at the state, we've got pretty low unemployment. It's 3.3% right now. Our labor force participation rate is a little bit lower than the national average by 4 points. There's 25,000 jobs available in the state right now. So if you do the math pretty quickly, people aren't taking the jobs because they're going to lose their benefits when you've got 30% of your population on some sort of state benefits. Once you tweak those things are going to start moving in the right direction. You get a little bit more money back in the coffers. And then the state right now, not a lot of people talk about this, but the Treasury cash pool is actually pretty flush with cash right now. We have more cash in there than we need, which could also be returned to taxpayers, reduce fees in other ways. But once you start to let some pressure out of the system, everything starts to move more effectively in the right direction.
You are listening to Q Point Podcast. I'm Karina Quirk, co-hosting with my husband, David Quirk, and we are speaking with Maine Republican gubernatorial candidate, Ben Midgley. As we all know, our electric bill is crazy high. How would you lower energy costs for families and businesses while preparing for future demand?
Energy is almost the root of all evil in the state, the way the policy has been set, because everybody depends on it. Whether you're a trucking company or you're an aggregate company or a lot of car dealerships, you've got a hospital you got to run, anything like that. When that bill goes up, you can't not pay it. You need energy one way or another. The biggest challenge we've had, obviously, is the ideological quest that everything has to be green energy, right? You got to force it at all costs, and you don't. So I think what happened, which everybody knows it's well discussed, is that the Democrats from top to bottom just followed the lead of the Biden administration and took a view that it's green energy at all costs, whatever the sacrifice, it's worth the cost, whatever the impact on people in the state, it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, you're going to save the environment. If you really look deeply I love the environment. Maine's mostly environment, so you kind of have to as a Mainer. But if you were to cut all the carbon out of Maine, 100%, I think you're going to reduce the world's temperature by 4 millionth of 1%. It's like 0.00001% contribution to carbon emissions. So at the end of the day, if you just do the math, we could take everything out of the state. It won't do anything. Not to sound negative, but it won't. So legislatively, they tried to figure out a clever way to subsidize solar production in the state, and that unfortunately was done on top of ratepayers' backs, which is tremendously unfair. Everybody's seen their electric bill double or triple. The public policy charge that was put on businesses is a killer. And, net energy billing has not helped at all, which you now see they're trying to backtrack on, saying they're making some changes on that before an election season comes up. But it's still going to cost ratepayers an extra $220 million for the next 10 years. But the challenge they have is the way they did it. Like, solar energy is not a bad thing to have, but you need to have free market principles drive that. And I'm involved a lot with private equity. I was just meeting with some friends that have they don't own it, but they're part of one of the largest private equity firms in the world, and they have a green energy fund. And they can produce solar energy non-subsidized in any way, shape, or form for 3 to 4 cents a kilowatt hour. And they're doing it in states and different countries all over the place. We do that at 20 cents while it's subsidized by Mainers who can't afford that. I've never been, I hate to say it, a huge fan of CMP, but they're stuck right in the middle. They're not the ones driving up the cost here. This is the state. So you've got to get this into more of a free market process. You have to get rid of these subsidies. You got to get that public policy charge off of businesses, allow solar to grow as the free market grows. I don't think you're going to turn it off at this point. 83% of all energy production now coming online worldwide is more green, and that includes nuclear and hydro and all those things too. So that's coming. You're not going to get rid of fossil fuels, right? The demand's going up on a regular basis, especially in a state like Maine. Most people heat their homes one way or another with that. We've got all sorts of diesel and fuel-based businesses that you have to have. So they're both going to coexist. But I do think over time, naturally, if you just push Maine out of these subsidized programs into a free marketplace principle, and you have to do that a little bit by executive order. Some has to be done through the legislature, so it depends on what the structure of the legislature is going to be after the next session, which is why it's so important we get a Republican House and as close to a Republican Senate as we can. And then you've got to do a lot of work with the corporations that have invested in Maine. You can put a little pressure on them. 80% of these businesses are from out of state. A lot of them are owned by private equity right now. There are businesses in New Jersey, and New York, and California, and not even all that energy is going to Maine. So you've got a lot of pieces you have to fix there, and you got to do it pretty quickly. But it's not going to be something you can do overnight, but you have to lean into it very hard as governor, and you've got to take pressure off the people that have been paying for this for years.
Obviously, being in business, and I'm sure you work just about every state of the country, you must know what's easier to get done in certain states versus what's getting done here in the state of Maine, versus the permitting, the electricity, the income tax, and the property tax, and everything else. As governor, what can you do to make this state more business-friendly than it ever has been before?
Yeah, honestly, you almost answered the question right there. So you just have to emulate what other states are doing that's driving them higher up on those business-friendly rankings. Maine's doing virtually none of that. So you could easily make 3 or 4 changes and get more businesses into the state. Energy has to happen. The extra burdensome fees and processes that they have to go through just to do business in Maine, which you all experience on a regular basis, is a big deal. Building is very challenging. It takes far too long to build in our state. On the residential side, we're building at half the national average. We're 80,000 units behind. There's no way to catch up. The largest builder in the state only accounts for 2.3% of the issue. And you just don't have that many very large builders that can get that done. Policies like Portland has, where if you don't build a certain amount of low-income housing, you're going to get a $182,000 fee per unit. If you don't do it, I mean, why would you build there? That's not a solution. It's a big stick. It's the exact wrong way to do it. But you change some of those things. You certainly reduce the corporate tax. Once we can get the personal tax down, then obviously more money is going to flow back into the economy. That makes the state budgets a little bit easier. It makes it easier for folks to afford housing, easier for folks to support their family in the state. Most people leave the state because they can't find the career and the income that they need. So you got to reverse those trends. And I'd like to think at some point Democrats are going to come along with that notion and support actually taking care of Maine families. I just don't think they're there yet. They got to get past that. But ideally, with the right person in charge and the right percentage of Republicans versus Democrats, we can get this going back in the right way.
And affordable housing.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest issues. I think the most recent report that came out said you had to make at least $60,000 just to afford a single bedroom apartment. And how many Mainers make $60,000? Right? Especially being one of the lowest income states in the country and one of the highest tax. My daughter works at a coffee shop, and she said, why is $30 coming out of my paycheck for FMLA? What does that even mean? She's 19. She's going to be paying into that for a long time. That was not well thought out. I understand the goal to have time for emergencies, but it was just very poorly thought out. And then folks that are never going to use it shouldn't have to pay it. And employers are having a hard time figuring out how are they going to even manage this because they don't really have much input on when people take time off. So it's going to be a big challenge for folks. So that really needs to be adjusted.
So I'm sure you saw the numbers of the education rankings for the state of Maine. What are your concerns with that?
Well, there's a lot of concerns with that. First, let me say, though, that teachers work very hard in the state. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that. And I do think teachers are underpaid. I think there's some teachers that are going over the top in terms of what they're trying to teach kids, in terms of what to think rather than how to think. But I don't want that to come across in any way as my view on teachers in general. I have incredible respect for teachers. The state, though, costs have gone up, 71%, and our test scores have gone down dramatically. It's a very convoluted system in Maine. There's a lot of different players involved. One, you've got the Commissioner of Education, which obviously you have to make that change pretty rapidly. State Board of Education, Maine School Management Association, Maine School Board Association, Maine School Principals Association, teachers unions, and then local school boards. So you have all these different groups contributing to what's going on in the state. So when you come in, it's not, and I've spent a significant amount of time on this with some of the smartest folks in the state on this topic. It's not the easiest thing to change rapidly. And if you look at the history of education in Maine, it's gone, this way and that way and this way and that way. And some things have succeeded, some things have failed. But when you make major changes too rapidly, you're taking this really large institution and you're asking them to change everything they're doing, learn something maybe with not enough training or proper testing and go in another direction. I think that's been one of the problems in the state over the years. Right now, the big issue is the focus on social emotional learning rather than focusing on test scores. Now, teachers have to be counselors and they have to have circle time and do all these different things. Not in every school system. You've got a lot of ideology in the schools. You got 57 school districts that will not tell a parent if their child is transitioning. I mean, it's hard to believe that they would interfere with a parent-child relationship like that. So there's so many different things you have to change in the school. The trick is, what are the most impactful things you can do right away to affect the greatest amount of change without really rocking the boat so much that the end users are affected too much and you cause more chaos than help. So I don't have a perfect answer for you yet. And honestly, I think if anybody does at this stage, they're not looking deep enough into the details because it needs change. It has to be changed. It's something that requires a day one plan, which we haven't fully formalized as a team yet, but we're getting more input. And then I think your day one plan needs to go into place so you can make moves as quickly and effectively as you can without causing any harm to the system. You certainly need more parental involvement. Parents have almost been shut out of schools in a lot of cases where they've lost their voice. So you've got to get parents re-engaged in that process so they feel like there's a little more faith and trust in the school and what they're doing with their kids, and keep the well-being of the student out and ahead of everything. And then you do have to focus on test scores to get those going back in the right direction. So I think you can hit 2 or 3 doubles pretty quick. But once you want to get to triples and home runs, it's going to take some hard work and some dedication. And you got to get a lot of buy-in. And you got to get all these disparate groups sort of working in the right direction. Some are going to be easier than others. And then I think you can get things on the right path. But you know what? That might be an 8-year project rather than a 4-year project to get that back where it needs to be.
Thank you for joining us for part 1 with Maine Republican gubernatorial candidate Ben Midgley. Make sure to tune in to part 2 tomorrow, Sunday, August 17th at 6:30 a.m. on VOM, the Voice of Maine. You don't want to miss it.
You've been listening to Q Point.
Follow us at qpointpodcast.com or on your favorite streaming app.
This is where you can get the news from the people who make the news.
Make sure to join us next time.
We hope you tune in.
Q Point Podcast invites candidates from all parties to join the conversation. The views, information, opinions, and comments expressed during this program do not necessarily represent those of the host, Q Point Podcast, associates, affiliates, and CQRE LLC.
Thanks for being a part of the conversation. Catch every episode at qpointpodcast.com or wherever you stream. Tune in and tell your friends.